Okay, so we are live now on YouTube.
Lou is allowing the participants to enter here. So there's the Zoom in and the YouTube. Okay. I just wait 1 minute here to get more people into the Zoom call. Well, I'll get going then this morning and welcome all of you to our book launch event featuring Professor Vania Penha-Lopes, who's our honored guest this morning and the author of a very important recent book entitled The Presidential Elections of Trump and Bolsonaro, Whiteness and the Nation. A great book. We are privileged, those of us here at the Columbia Global Center in Rio de Janeiro, to welcome Professor Vania Penha-Lopes, who will I'll introduce you more appropriately in just a few moments. The book itself, I think the importance of the book, the title conveys. It's a wonder no one has written it before. It's a book I think Vania is going to tell us why she wrote it, but in my judgment, it's a book that, in a sense, demanded to be read, to be written, I should say, and to be read. I just briefly synopsize what I understood, Vania, from this complex undertaking, sort of a key concept for me that I'll quote from the book, that whiteness and white supremacy have been the basis of the idea of nation in the United States and Brazil. The elections of Trump and Bolsonaro were the continuation of centuries-old trends. In both countries, some groups have been excluded. So they keep trying to belong in ways that keep us asking, what is a nation? So while this focuses on the two central political characters who need no introduction, obviously, the longer-term context is important to have. So I'd like to welcome you again, Vania, and as I say, I'll introduce you more properly in a minute, and I'd like to show people that this book is available. If you can read it, maybe not. The book is available to be downloaded on, from various, for those of you in Brazil who have difficulty accessing the physical copy, you can download it. I have a great cast here, Vania, to join us, to listen to you and then to interact with you. I'll mention briefly, and then again, more formally a little bit later on, I'll present him to you. Professor G. Reginald Daniel Reg of the University of California, Santa Barbara, will provide comments and pose the critical issues to Vania. And again, Reg, I'll introduce you more formally in a little bit, in just a little bit. Some logistical questions. We have simultaneous translation. You should be able to see it at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And for interpretation, the event will be conducted largely in English. Please use the Q&A function to help us make this a successful and participatory event. And if you want to even just go on the Q&A and say hello, or tell Vania where you're calling in from, that'd be a good use of that function. Just make frequent use of it as you listen to their comments, and we'll get to as many of your questions toward the end of the of our event this morning. Finally, I'd like to mention, although we're at the Columbia Global Centers in Rio, our co-host today is the University Seminar in Brazil at Columbia University, a very proud and distinguished institution, that is to say the University Seminars. And I'm very, very pleased to have Sid Green, one of the co-chairs, Sidney Greenfield, one of the co-chairs of the University Seminar. And Sid has graciously offered to sit in and tell us a little bit about the University Seminar and maybe how this book, this very important book by Vania Penha-Lopes relates to the University Seminar. Just briefly, Sid Greenfield is a professor of anthropology emeritus at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and he's co-chair of the Columbia University Seminars on Brazil, as I said. He has conducted ethnographic research on a wide range of problems, including syncretized Brazilian religions such as Candomblé, Umbanda, and has studied as well evangelical Protestants in Brazilian politics. He's the author and editor of many books, right, Sid, and articles, and he has been a foundational figure at Columbia University in terms of keeping current discussion, academic as well as contemporary political discussion alive on Brazil at the university and open to a broad university audience. So Sid, welcome to the webinar, and turn to you for your own introductory remarks. Thank you. Sid, I think you're muted there if you want to just unmute yourself.
Heavens, I thought I unmuted before. Okay, thanks, Tom. It's an honor for me to present Professor Vania Penha-Lopes today. And as Tom said, he will be doing a more extensive introduction, so I will not mention her numerous awards and honors. I have known Vania at first through her participation in the university seminar on Brazil, and especially since Diana Brown and I invited her to join us as co-chair of the seminar. Dr. Penha-Lopes has presented much of her research at the seminar during its formative stages. I have been able to see firsthand the development of her sharp mind and incisive thinking. The work she has done on race relations and Brazilian affirmative action through the quota system has made a valuable contribution to our understanding. When she first proposed writing a book comparing the elections of Donald Trump and Jair Bolsonaro and presented her earliest thinking at the seminar, I must admit that my first reaction, that I certainly did not share with Vania at the time, was why would she want to put all that effort into observing and writing about such despicable characters, masters of fake news and the big lie? But it was an important task, so we all encouraged her. I could think of few people who are more qualified to write such a book. Vania was born and received her early education in Rio and has spent the academic year in the United States, where she has been teaching since earning her MA in anthropology and PhD in sociology at New York University. While there, she met and became a very close friend of the daughter of friends of ours in Milwaukee. Dr. Miriam Edelman, who married a Brazilian and now lives in Curitiba, babysat for our children. Small world. Summers and all other vacation periods, Vania spends in Rio. So she has lived through the impacts of Trump and Bolsonaro have had on both countries. Vania is bilingual and bicultural and has grown to understand what has happened in Brazil and the United States as both a sociologist and someone who lives in each nation. In addition, Vania speaks and writes exceptionally well in both languages. The result has been a very insightful book that we all should read. It may make you angry at times, but you may learn much you did not know before.
Thank you, Sid, for that very graceful and very complete introduction. I think Vania will probably agree that more introduction for me is not needed, although probably I'll still go ahead and say that it's in line with recent important academic work that Vania Penha-Lopes has provided us. In particular, although the title is available in Portuguese, in particular her work on affirmative action in Brazil and university quotas. I think one of what we thought was a turning point, right, Vania, in race relations in Brazil. And Vania has been a voice crying in the desert, looking at that issue, bringing the facts and figures to our attention and arguing about its effectiveness, criticizing it as appropriate, but also calling attention to its importance. Vania, consider yourself introduced. We will then turn to you for what could be up to 15 minutes or so, Vania. I know you prepared an answer to that standard question of why you wrote this book. But in addition, maybe tell us a little bit what's in the book. this very readable and important volume, which Sid has outlined so nicely for us. So welcome, Vania Penha-Lopes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Sid, and Reg, Diana, Ellie, who I also see. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Good afternoon in Brazil. Good morning in New York. Good morning on the West Coast where Reg is. Thank you so much for these generous introductions, and a lot of what I was going to say about who I am, both you, Tom, and Sid have already said, but I'll tell you things that you didn't know about me. So you already know that I'm a professor of sociology who specializes in comparative race relations, especially Brazil and the United States. But what you probably did not know is that my interest in race is practically lifelong. When I was 5 years old, I already knew I wanted to be a scientist and a writer. And I know that there are people in the audience, such as my mother, my sister, cousins, who remember me as a 5-year-old saying I was going to be a scientist and a writer and an English teacher. But influenced by my father at the time, I thought I was going to be a natural scientist. But then at age 14, it was Sunday. It was time to watch Fantástico, that Sunday show, perennial Sunday show. And that one particular Sunday, they had a segment on race, on which they had Gilberto Freire, none other than the articulator of the ideology of racial democracy, and Darcy Ribeiro, a very famous Brazilian anthropologist. And Gilberto Freire said that in 50 years' time, Brazil would be a country of mulattoes. And I got an instant interest. It's like, well, what, you can study race? Well, that's what I want to do. And so that's when the social scientist was born in me. And from then on, I'd interview my relatives, especially my paternal grandfather, who was the son of an enslaved woman, about their experiences with racism, because this being the dictatorship in Brazil, the whole point was, yes, this is a racial democracy. You don't talk about race. There is no racism in Brazil, but we talked about it at home, and yeah, we had experiences that attested to the contrary. So my bachelor's in social sciences focused on race and later ethnicity. And when I was in my third year of my bachelor's, I entered a contest by the Encyclopedia Britannica of Brazil for scholarships for study abroad. And I wrote an original ethnography on an Afro-Brazilian Catholic Brotherhood, Venerável Irmandade de Santo Elisbão e Santa Ifigênia, on the issue of ethnicity, Blackness as an ethnicity in Brazil. And that was what brought me to the United States to do a master's, which turned out to be also a PhD. And my graduate work focused on race in the United States, and I've been teaching race and ethnicity ever since. Early in the century, as Tom mentioned, I learned about affirmative action in Brazil, which took the form of university quotas, and how that program was often compared to the US model, even though the US model is not based on quotas. So I wrote 2 books about it, one in Portuguese and one in English, based on life histories of a sample of the first class of graduating quota students from the State University of Rio. And for the English version, I introduced the idea of race as a mirror. In other words, how both the United States and Brazil use race to think of themselves and to compare themselves to each other. And after I finished that book, I got an interest in studying whiteness. It's like, well, all my life we're studying non-whites, but what about, whites as a category? And the invisibility of it concerned me, because even in scholarly works, white has stood for people in general, which means that it's the normative. People will say, oh, that person over there, as opposed to that Black person over there. or some other race or ethnicity. So, and also the use of the term people of color to refer to non-whites, which has become more common, also intrigues me. I think it contributes to that invisibility by implying that whites are devoid of color, right? So people of color versus what? Invisible people, colorless people, when in fact, whiteness is the race or color whose higher power grants it the privilege of being normative and therefore invisible. So why did I write this book, Sid? Well, after, as I said, and as Sid said, my decades of teaching race and ethnicity and living a binational life as a Brazilian Black academic, and I live in New York, but I spend lots of times in Rio. The idea for this book came when I was voting for president in October of 2018 for the Brazilian presidential elections. I voted in New York City, and I was in line, and I saw and heard a group of Brazilians chanting, "Make Brazil great again," in Portuguese, "Make Brazil great again." And 17, which was the number of Bolsonaro's political party at the time, the Social Liberal Party. I went home and I started to jot down ideas for this book because to me, the comparison was so obvious. So in Trump's campaign, there was an emphasis on saving the country, saving the economy, and saving the country from undesirables, such as Mexican and Middle Eastern immigrants who are racialized as non-white in the United States currently. And in Bolsonaro's campaign, there was also an emphasis on saving the country from corruption and promoting public safety. And he also negated the existence of racism while referring to minorities in dismissive ways, and also while his vice president, running mate, referred to his grandson as that good-looking white guy over there. Do you see? That's betterment of the race, he said during the campaign. Though the two countries have defined whiteness in diametrical opposition, since the United States constructs whiteness as racially pure, whereas Brazil assumes that white is the result of racial mixture, I argued that the success of each candidate reflects the racially hierarchical structure of their societies, as well as the strength of the ideology of white supremacy that is necessary for that structure to remain in place, despite efforts to dismantle it. By the way, Tom, your summation was brilliant, very thorough. According to that logic, regardless of class and gender, whites responded to Trump's nativist call to exclude undesirable immigrants, especially Mexican and Muslims, as I said before, and make America great again. In Brazil, the country with the largest population of African descent outside of Africa and the largest miscegenation rates in the world, the votes for Bolsonaro pointed to the social wish to achieve whiteness and thus eliminate or at least abate the insecurity that comes from a belief in the racial inferiority of non-whites. Based on that argument, I suggest that the results of the presidential elections reflect a fear by whites that their higher status was being threatened after decades of gains by minorities, women, and the poor in both countries. If we look at the histories of each country, as I do in my book, neither Trump nor Bolsonaro is unique or unlike any other president in their countries. If there was an innovation in their campaigns, it was their use of social media, including introducing the term fake news to refer to information that went against them, while planting false information about their opponents. As for the idea of nation, I have long been intrigued by the myth of the US as the land of the free, when non-whiteness has denied people so many rights throughout history, including being a citizen. At the same time, I have also been intrigued by the myth of racial democracy in Brazil when the country has made a concerted effort to make the inclusion of non-whites difficult and to dilute so-called Black blood. So who belongs? We could say that both countries continue to grapple with their slavery past and have yet to resolve their repercussions in the present. So I could say that history, life and society, and my own personal experience have led me to write this book. As Tom said, as Sid said, I was in New York when Trump was inaugurated. I was in Rio when Bolsonaro was inaugurated, and again in New York when Trump lost the 2020 election. As fate would have it, the COVID pandemic spread while I was home in Rio writing this book. The similarities between the two presidents were glaring in the way that they dealt with the pandemic, with Trump's behavior clearly serving as a model for Bolsonaro in their denial of science and the similar consequences that ensued. I'll stop here for now. Thank you.
Wow, we were just getting to thank you very much. It's right, a round of applause and congratulations, Vania, Professor Penha-Lopes. I just might, if they could, I've got a minute or two before we want to turn to Professor and bring Professor Daniel into the conversation, but I wonder if I could extend you just a little bit more. And it may be my own penchant for looking for the optimistic part of the story. In fact, you mentioned Trump wasn't reelected. I wonder whether you would classify what's happening. There's the reaction with critical race theory. There are all these issues going on in the United States, but do you look at what's happening in the United States on the positive side, that maybe a realization that we're not a raceless, classless society is gathering here? You've mentioned other potential turning points in U.S. history. You mentioned the Civil War, Reconstruction, the New Deal, the Voting Rights Act, the election of Obama. None of them proved to be turning points. But I'm wondering if you might leave us both in the United States and maybe also in Brazil, where it's unlikely, who knows, but it's unlikely that President Bolsonaro will be reelected here in Brazil as well. Do we then look, is there sort of a bias for hope, or is this simply more chapters in an ongoing centuries-old history in both countries?
Oh, what an easy question to answer, Tom. I often say that social scientists are not good at making predictions. Okay, but I think the point that I try to make is that both countries have a history of struggling with these two oppositions, right? So that's why neither president is innovative. I think that the fact that Biden was the vice president of the first Black president and is the president of the first Black vice president of the United States, we have to believe that there are enough people in the United States who would like for the country to actually realize its potential of being, for the people in general, and not just the restricted one from the beginning. So I think it's possible, but then on the other hand, we see these currents in the United States with voter suppression and ways of decreasing the strength of the vote of those who tend to clamor for a more open country, for a more egalitarian country. So I don't know. I think Biden has a lot in his administration, right? Have a lot on their shoulders because the other side is not dormant, right? So in the long run, 4 years is a very short time. And in Brazil, we see that too. It's like talking about race has become, and racism has become much more frequent in Brazil. Certainly the country has changed in that regard in the past 50 years, I would say, just by the fact of talking about it and acknowledging it and implementing policies. But then again, there are those who are against those policies and who would like for time to go back. So
there we are.
Yeah.
Thank you, Vania. I'll stop this one. I know Sid's got his hand up. Sid, I can either go to a quick question for you now or come back to you at the start of the Q&A. What would you prefer?
I just wanted to ask Vania if you could talk a little bit about the role of evangelical Protestants in the election of both of these people.
I knew you were going to ask me about that.
Surprise!
Well, that is one of the similarities between the two campaigns, the two presidents, right? That both went for the evangelical vote, and in both countries, evangelicals are a growing force, right? In the United States, I think, well, correct me if I'm wrong, Sid, but I think there's a longer history in the United States, right? But I can remember in the 80s, the whole, the televangelists and the Oral Roberts and the I have sinned, but they, continued, and they're politically strong. And in Brazil, it's a relatively more recent phenomenon, but, evangelicals are also a force to behold. And what I find interesting is that it's how evangelicals embraced these two candidates when they tend to be socially conservative, given the fact that both both candidates have been married 3 times. And, that was pushed aside, right? And it's in the case of the United States, Hillary Clinton was even a Sunday school teacher. She has very strong roots in the church, but that was kind of dismissed.
Thank you so much, Vania. Notice more to be said about that, but let me jump in at this point when we come back to this issue of religious groups that's playing out here, as you know, Sid, in the elections coming up this year with some division within the evangelical community here in Brazil, which is a very important constituency. But with that, I'd like to maybe move on with our formal program, if I can use that word, and introduce Professor G. Reginald Daniel. Reg is a professor of sociology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. His teaching and research focus on comparative race and ethnic relations, particularly as this relates to multiracial individuals of partial African descent in Brazil, which their numbers are legion, in South Africa, and in the United States. Since 1989, he doesn't look old enough to have this to actually true, but it is. Since 1989, he's taught betwixt and between multiracial identity, one of the first and longest standing university courses in the United States to deal specifically with the question of multiracial identity, comparing the US with various parts of the world. He's the author of many books and articles which have been fundamental contributions to the modern examination of multiracial identity in the United States, Brazil, South Africa, and no doubt elsewhere as well. I want to thank you, Reg, for getting up early this morning in California, having had your coffee before the webinar, and welcome you for your comments on Vania's book and maybe some questions you'd like to pose to her. So good morning and welcome, Professor Daniel. I think you're muted, Reg, if you can unmute there, can you?
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. I'm so delighted to be here. I have known Vania's work for quite some time, her particular book on affirmative action. We've had numerous conversations via email. And when she mentioned that she was going to write this book on Bolsonaro and Trump, I was beside myself. I said, oh my God, somebody has to do this. And I said, this is the craziest thing she could possibly do. I just thought, oh my God. So, and I didn't hear from her for a while in terms of the progress. The next thing I knew, boom, the thing is getting ready to go into print. And I went, oh, wow, I want to use it for my class. And so I'm using it this quarter along with my own textbook on Brazil. And the two mesh very well in terms of the arguments that are being made. So I was really excited about it. And she will be speaking in my class at the end of the quarter. And what I would say is that her book is timely, it's smart, it's ambitious, and it's very rich in detail. I mean, it's very rich in detail, and it's an accessible book that in terms of its examination, so that scholars, college students, as well as the general public would be able to read it with great enthusiasm in terms of its examination of socioeconomic and political forces that help propel Bolsonaro and Trump to power. It encompasses a very incisive analysis of the role of white supremacy and white nationalism in terms of the role it played, not only the campaigns, but also the administrations. I mean, that is very central to think about that. And also the tremendous damage that both have inflicted on democratic institutions in Brazil and the United States, as well as their administration's failures to effectively manage the COVID pandemic. And then I would just finally say that it's truly a masterful comparative analysis of these fateful and yet not surprisingly intertwined developments, including their implications for race relations and anti-racist organizing by extension in both countries. Since there are people who are attending who will probably have other questions, I will move on to the two that I have. One is on Brazil. The other one is on the United States. And I know Vania could probably go on at great length for both of them. But the question I would ask Vania on Brazil is, given his racist demagoguery, as well as authoritarian rhetoric and attitudes, why do you think so many Blacks and Browns, or pretos and pardos, voted for Bolsonaro? Well, how would you explain that?
Well, I think one way of explaining that is, we're sociologists, so human variation. So, and our behavior is not always rational, right? Not always logical. That's one way, but I don't mean to say that these people are illogical, the people who were Black and voted for him, Blacks and Browns voted for him. But maybe in light of my argument, maybe it's an attempt to belong, to be truly part of the nation. So yeah, we are Brazilians like everybody else. And let's not forget that Bolsonaro's campaign, a large part of it was the promise to combat violence and to sponsor public safety. And Brazil is the country that kills the most Blacks in the world, especially the young, and not just by the police. So Blacks are among the victims of brutality, including in their own communities. So if a candidate comes and said, I'm going to make this better, I think it makes sense for somebody to believe that maybe that could be done. The thing is, at the same time, I think it's interesting because we Blacks in Brazil are stereotyped as criminals. So if there were going to be an attempt at combating criminality, we would be targeted, just by virtue of the way we look. Having said all that, I was looking at surveys from last year, and among the people, the voters who are disappointed with Bolsonaro, there's a large number of Blacks and Browns, pretos e pardos, according to the census classifications. In fact, this is as of April of last year. So intention to vote in the 2022 election. 51% of Brazilians who self-identify as pardos and 82% of those who self-identify as pretos disapprove of Bolsonaro's tenure. So, and then as of June of last year, one survey showed that over 40% of Blacks and Browns intend to vote for Lula this year, as opposed to 18% who intend to vote for Bolsonaro. So maybe, they had that hope they got disappointed, and now they're going to go back to like rejecting it. I'll mention one more thing, which was not one, well, the strategy of having always that congressperson Hélio Lopes, also known as Hélio Negão, next to Bolsonaro, very dark-skinned Black man who kept saying there is no racism in this country. So we have to, as I started out by saying, you know, not every, just as in the United States, right? Blacks vary in their interpretation of, you know, social and political, economic.
Marvelous, as I expected. And you can
Thank you,
go on,
Professor.
I thought tough. I mean, that's a tough question to answer in such a short period of time. But it's, you know, and you address some of this in your book in various kinds of ways. The other question I would ask about the United States, this all might, in some ways, may actually have the answer embedded in the question. But, you know, I would ask, what is the allure of the Republican Party for white Americans? I mean, that's definitely an allure. And it's increased considerably since the Obama administration and has gotten way out of proportion since the Trump administration. And then it's kind of like, wow, this is taking us back to like the pre-Civil War era. What is this about?
Well, in my book, I rely on current scholarship, on scholars who have actually analyzed the results of the election. I cite a lot of like David Smith, for example, from University of Kansas, who looked at the region of the voters who voted for Bolsonaro. So there's a regional component. It's like, you know, they are not in the East Coast, right? Not in the Northeast. They tend to be in states that are more white, in states that are more conservative. And a number of, you know, of these scholars have agreed that the allure is we have to hold on to our ground, right? Arlie Oakshield has a great book also about that, about Southerners, white Southerners, most of whom are evangelicals, who really feel that the fabric of the country is being torn apart, you know, that it's immoral, and that these people are getting too much power, right? As you said, right before this, almost like before the Civil War. And my concern is that all these efforts being made to suppress the vote, creating subterfuges to prevent people from voting. And so I think that both parties have to take into account, you know, the way people vote, why they vote. And I'm thinking of the Latino vote, right? Which needs to be disaggregated. Latinos are now the largest minority in the United States, but they are not amorphous. So Hillary Clinton took that for granted and ended up getting fewer votes than she expected. You know, she got fewer votes from Latinos than Obama had, even though Latinos, well, Trump was attacking Mexicans. But not every Latino is Mexican, even though Mexicans are the largest Latino group in the United States. So I think what we will probably see in the next presidential election in the United States is this. It's like Republicans really catering to Latino vote and trying to disaggregate them. And but yeah, to me, the greatest concern today is voter suppression, right? Because if you prevent people from voting, then they are no longer citizens.
And, you know, as a little bit of a segue, the Republican Party currently is a minority party. And the only way, you know, they can maintain their power essentially is to do these kinds of things, such as voter suppression, redistricting, through a variety of strategies. What would be, you think, why wouldn't they think about redesigning their platform to appeal to a larger number of people? But that's not the direction they're going. They're going the exact opposite. We want to maintain power. We don't care what we have to do it. We're not interested in what anyone else has to say. Our power is more important than anything else, including the country's well-being.
Right. And I'd like to quote Carol Anderson, a legal scholar, whom I quote in my book. She writes, in the 21st century, the geography of voter suppression had clearly changed. It was no longer only a phenomenon of the Jim Crow South. Voter suppression had now gone nationwide as it became a Republican-fueled chimera that by 2017 had griped 33 states and cast a pall over more than half the American voting age population. So that's the thing. So if it's going, if it's reaching such a large population, then it may work for the Republican Party.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's amazing. Real quickly, what's interesting is that they're calling them Zoomers, generation 19 to 20 to 30 years old. Most diverse cohort in US history, are heavily Democratic in terms of their preferences. And I'm thinking that if they have an impact in voting for the next elections, we may see some outcomes with that, because they definitely are like 60% in favor of Democratic ideas or agenda, much more so than Republican ones.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Reg, because then it brought me back to what Tom asked me before of this glimmer of hope. I think it's important to point out that, yeah, the younger generation is actually much more open than previous generations. They are more open about race, about gender, about everything. Yes. Yeah. So that's the thing, that part that I don't mean to say, oh, it'll always be this way. No, because there are these currents, right, of change and of hope. But I think that's what, keeps the fight going, because
for sure.
The other side's like, no, we have to contain them.
Thank you for both of those very insightful and inspiring, actually, also comments. Very much appreciated.
Thank you, Reg.
Reg, we're not going to let you questions. We're not going to let you off the hook, Reg.
What?
You'll jump in. You'll jump in if you went. I'm going to turn to the Q&A, but maybe just to balance off the fascinating conversation you're having, and remind folks, please contribute your comments. Se quiserem, podem escrever em português. Write your comments in the Q&A. We'll be monitoring them and trying to get as many of them as we can. But before we do turn to the very interesting questions that are already there, Vania, could you maybe balance out what you're talking about now by looking a little bit at whiteness in Brazil? I mean, here in Brazil, if you're Afro-American, people know you are African-American. But in a country where 55% or so, right, I've got the number right, of the population can claim to be Afro-Descendant or Afro-Brazilian in some sense. How can we be racist here? Because we're all African, right? Your book addresses that question. And we're unequal and we have all these problems we have, but we can't be racist because, in fact, we'd be racist, we'd be critical of our very selves. Your book addresses it, and I wonder if I could just ask you to address that. Reg, it relates a little bit to you because it's kind of mixed race issues here in Brazil come into play. But Vania, please, and then we'll turn to the questions.
Well, I'm going to turn to Irving Goffman's insights from his book Stigma, and so many others, but particularly Stigma. What we are, who we are, it's not just how we see ourselves. It's how others see us. It's a combination of the two, and depending on the amount of power that group has in society, then a person will have more or less leeway in defining who they are. So the majority of Brazilians are Afro-descendant because, genetic research shows that even most whites in Brazil can trace their descent through mitochondrial DNA through some African ancestor, usually a woman. But that doesn't mean that they see themselves as Black or as even mixed, right? No, we are, I have this great grandmother, but I'm white. Okay, so you know that's the way it is in Brazil, although this has also changed a bit, right? With more people, it's like, no, I'm acknowledging their mixed ancestry. But I think the ideology of racial democracy is very strong. People grow up thinking that Brazilians are more comfortable discussing class inequality than racial inequality. So it's not really racism, it's class, and once you ascend, this will go away. When I was growing up, I was like, look at Pelé. It was always Pelé.
Yeah. Yeah.
And nowadays, there are many other examples. But I think, we see the racism in Brazil, like, and Reg has written about it extensively, that veiled way that is becoming more common in the United States, by the way, right? To be, it's not racism, it is, but it's so veiled that it appears that it isn't. And so in Brazil, you have that, like everything that defines Brazil, everything that Brazil wants the world to recognize as Brazilian is Afro-Brazilian, right? It's samba, it's the music, it's the dance, it's the, our the way we are, we're so happy with this. So all of that is traced to Africa. But then at the same time, there is that inferiority complex, that fear of degeneration that was implanted in the late 19th century that we still see operating, and sometimes it comes out in very violent ways and very visibly, not veiled at all.
Thank you. And meanwhile, whites remain at the top of all the hierarchies, right? Vania, you make that point here in Brazil.
Right.
Reg, any final comments from you before we turn to the audience questions?
Well, I would say, I just echo everything Vania has said. And I think one of the complexities or challenges of doing anti-racist work in Brazil is that whiteness is so encompassing in ways that it's not in the United States, that it can actually encompass people who have African ancestry, who know they do, and are totally disengaged in anti-racist work. So it siphons off a lot of people who might have anti-racist awareness. Afro-Descendant, if you translate that literally, is like the entire country. And yet that also is not the way the country has perceived itself, notwithstanding the racial democracy ideology. So I'm thinking one tactic that would be central is that, you have African ancestry. What are you doing about the status of those people who are African and Brazilian designated in terms of socioeconomic status and other kinds of things? Politicize that, do something, become active. And I don't think the majority of white Brazilians who do have African ancestry are doing anything but trying to take advantage of affirmative action to use it to their advantage rather than actually dealing with anti-racist work.
Good, Rich. Thank you very much. Well, let me turn to some of the questions here. Maybe the panelists themselves can kind of scroll through and see what other questions they'd like to address. But one of them has to do with other groups, Vania, and something maybe that hasn't come up much in our conversation today. Yes, it's racial, but there are other excluded groups, and you are particularly eloquent, I think, in the LGBTQ plus community in both countries. And while those kind of people are to be pushed aside and aren't really truly Brazilians or Americans, is by implication, and other groups. One of the questions here has to do with the Jewish community and why, and it brings back anti-Semitism in both countries to some extent. But other excluded groups, Vania, that you mentioned, as I say, constantly, I think there's a constant theme throughout the book, not to forget that it's not just a matter of race.
Oh yeah, right. Yeah, and in the book, as you said, Tom, I talk about that in general. But I think the point that I'm making is that in the end, the main issue is between Black and white. because, for example, as I show in chapter 1 of my book, The History of the United States, who is white is a very important question. There was a time when not even Europeans were white, certain Europeans, right? After the Great Immigration. So the Irish were not considered white. The Poles weren't considered white. Greeks, Italians were lynched in Mississippi. Greeks, I mentioned them, Portuguese, Jews from Eastern Europe were not considered white. And then after World War II, they become white. And so there is there anti-Semitism in the United States? Is there anti-Semitism in Brazil? Yes, but comparatively speaking, what is the likelihood that, for example, Jews will be excluded from places when, in fact, they were excluded from universities, from jobs, 100 years ago? The same thing with the Irish. I mention in my book, that's just one example, or Mexicans who used to be classified as white by the US Census until 1930. Then they became not white. And nowadays, nobody thinks of Mexicans as white, even though there are whites in Mexico. So, but in the book, I also talk about misogyny and how, politically women are a minority. I talk about the attacks in Brazil, especially the LGBTQIA plus community, and like very blatant attacks. So we could even say that now that in Brazil, people are acknowledging racism more, we are seeing the last frontier. Oh, let's go after blatantly after LGBTQ plus people, but and also, as I said, Latinos in the United States, certain groups of Latinos are more accepted than others. So absolutely, same thing with Asian Americans. So yeah, ethnicity matters, race matters. But I think in the end, when push comes to shove, is who is white, and ends up with.
Very, very good. One of the interesting questions I took, there's a number of them on the Q&A, but of interest maybe to you, Vania, and also to you, Reg. And I'll translate briefly. This says, how do we talk to children or in the classroom? This is a very current issue that Brazilians may not perceive this in the United States. How do we talk to children in the classroom or at home about race and racism in the United States and in Brazil? And how do we engage with an anti-racist pedagogy, which we're doing in the United States, that it's touched up a firestorm protest? Vania,
I love that question. Reg, would you like to answer it, Reg? Or
No, it's your show.
Okay. There's no business like show business. So let's
there you go.
I love this question because one thing that is very, I think, very important when we study race, ethnicity, relations, is to understand and realize that there is such a thing as difference, right? We see human variation. We are not all the same. The problem is when difference becomes inequality. Difference does not have to lead to inequality. So how do we talk to children? Yeah, we children are born seeing those differences, right? Children, especially before age 5, they're so keen on those and they're curious about it. So what we cannot do is suppress that curiosity, because I think that creates like a little seed, plants a little seed for inequality. Why can't I talk about it? So I'll tell the story. It's a true story of a neighbor's child. Today he's an adult, but as a little boy, and he's white. I was once talking to his grandmother. He was there, and we used to be neighbors. And I gesture as I talk, and then all of a sudden he said, "How come?" And he was 3 years old. how come your hand has two colors? And well, that's very insightful, right? His hand didn't have two colors. So his grandmother said, oh, stop it. So I said, well, that's a legitimate question. It does have two colors. And I said, it's because I'm Black. So, everybody's hand, the inside is white, but when you turn it, it can come in different colors.
Yeah.
I said, oh, really? So that makes you Black? I said, yeah. So he had never even noticed that I was Black, right? So then he goes, so does that mean that Juma's also Black, my sister? Yeah. And grandma, he called my mother and father grandma and grandpa. Grandma Jiva is Black. Yeah. Grandpa Elliot. Yeah. Oh, okay. End of the story. So, I think that's why, like the younger generations are more open and actually less racist, because, it's okay to acknowledge difference. We don't want all of us to be the same, but we want to have access to life chances in the same way.
Reg, any comments on that?
That's marvelous. Also, there's almost nothing I can add to that. What I would say, it depends on the grade level you're talking about, but there's a marvelous curriculum. It has not been implemented across the board in public schools called anti-bias curriculum that teaches young children how to come to terms with difference and not evaluate difference based on hierarchy, to embrace difference as part of a normative part of life. How do you teach junior high, high school, and college kids? That's a whole different ballgame because they have more maturity, et cetera. And you can give them access to more historical detail and what have you. But anti-bias curriculum, and there's a marvelous documentary called Starting Small, which looks at various schools that have implemented this curriculum. And the stories will bring tears to your eyes when you see how these young children are thinking about difference and questions of fairness based on difference in ways that, imagine what that would be like if across the country, schools were doing this, and people would say it's mind control. But the point is that it's marvelous technology that already does exist, along with Montessori also. Those together provide a wonderful opportunity for children to develop the kinds of skills that they will need in the kind of world we're more moving towards, in terms of being able to deal with diversity and difference without that being divisive.
Mm-hmm.
When you've been kind of toward the end of our time, we go a little bit longer, although I know some people have to drop off. I won't go too much, but I do want to handle a few of the other questions. Peter Fry is asking you to comment on the anti-intellectualism of Trump and Bolsonaro. I think in general, he means he's talking particularly about the intellectual class here in Brazil, which he mentions is predominantly white, feels besieged and has lost control over the Brazilian state. But I think just generally anti-intellectualism, anti-science, anti-learning, anti-thinking for oneself, and that whole current, underlying current, especially for those of us connected with universities, it's a particularly galling aspect of Trump.
Yes. Hi, Peter. That's something. It's glaring, right, in both countries. And what comes to mind is Neil Postman's book, Amusing Ourselves to Death. I think that in the 1980s, that was already visible. So it's not a new phenomenon, right? The anti-intellectualism of, we want entertainment. So Postman wrote that it's like everything is becoming entertainment. So the news have to be entertaining. So they're no longer information, it's infotainment. Religiosity, practicing it is something that is supposed to be sacred. No, but then when you put it on TV, when it happened in the 80s, that was all, it ceases to be religion per se, it becomes entertainment, and it's mindless. The unifying thing was like mindless entertainment. And I think it's a paradox that the more available information is to all of us, the less people are interested in acquiring that information, right? I mean, we literally have it in the palm of our hand, and yet it's like this is too long. People are reading less, and to understand certain things, we have to read more. So, like about anti-intellectualism, it's like it's anti-science, because science and those who practice it are seen as pompous, right? But the interesting thing is that the elite has not stopped being interested in and engaged in science, right? So I think it's an idea that is spread out to the masses. That's another way of, keeping some in power, because once people are aware of, no, I read about this is wrong, and we saw this during the pandemic, right? You're saying that science doesn't work. What do you mean science doesn't work? What do you mean vaccines are nonsense? There's a whole.
Yeah. It's so. We do need to wrap up. I want my co-host Sid maybe to feel free, Sid, if you'd like to make a final comment or question of your own to either of to Vania or to Reg. I'd like to give you the opportunity now, and thank you again, and Diana and everyone else from the University Seminar in Brazil for working to produce this. Go ahead, Sid.
Okay, well, just to follow up on this notion of anti-science, and a speaker at a seminar I was at the other day was essentially saying that science is the basis of Western civilization as we know it. And this is, intellectuals deal with this. And if you go back to my question about the evangelicals, this is where they've been fighting science since they came into business with Pentecostalism. And the whole movement, if you look at it in terms of the right wing galvanizing around religion and anti-science, this essentially is what you've got happening. And again, I go back and say, if you look through the literature of the evangelicals, they include, there are people in there who are preaching race theory. So all of this seems to come together.
You said, Vania, any comments?
Thank you again, Vania.
Yeah.
What did you say, Sid? I didn't hear you.
Thank you again.
Oh, you're welcome, Sid.
And obrigado.
Obrigada. No, I'm fine, Tom.
Good. I don't know if you want to respond to what Sid is asking quickly. Might have about 30 seconds if you do. And basically, I think Sid's point says that evangelical Protestants saying this because their pastors and preachers are teaching them, and this is what their religion tells them to believe, or are they getting it all? They're just kind of historically belong to a religion, and they basically get their news from Fox News or right-wing media outlets here in Brazil. I think you've let.
And they have their own network of television stations and radio stations that they learn from, that sometimes we leave out of our thinking.
Yeah.
Now, I'll say this, I have that in the book.
Good.
I talk about all of that, and the media, and how CNN, for example, was constructed as Clinton News Network, and Fox became Trump's network. And in Brazil, you have the evangelical channel, and that also supported Bolsonaro. So I have that in the book. And that's for those of you who are interested.
And that includes, man, that's one more reason that you should all buy this book.
Buy the book.
Buy the book.
Buy the book. Don't just go with this so wonderful summary that we have here today. The book is entitled The Presidential Elections of Trump and Bolsonaro, Whiteness and the Nation. And as there it is, available to be downloaded for those of you listening in Brazil. So no excuse if you can't find it in the local livraria, you could download it. And I want to thank you all for being here. In kind of reverse order, Sid and Diana and the other members of the University Seminar. Reg, I hope that we can call on you again. And now that you finally met Vania, which is an unexpected dividend of this webinar, we can all deal with you in the future. Thank you so much for your insightful comments and your enthusiasm and inspiration this morning. And Vania.
So early in the morning.
So early in the morning. Yeah. And Vania, just a final parting thought from you, and then we'll say goodbye and thank all of our many listeners here online and those who've been hearing us on YouTube, and many more who will be listening to us on the tape version. Go ahead, Vania.
I want to thank you, Tom, for your wonderful invitation. You and your staff, and the panelists, Reg and Sid, and Diana was there also, and Ellie next to Sid, and all of you who are watching and listening to us. This is a wonderful opportunity for me to talk about my work. I'm obviously very passionate about it. So thank you again, all of you.
Welcome you anytime you want to. You're back here in Brazil. Be with us. Thank you again, Vania. Sid is again leading us, and a small round of applause. A brilliant book. Someone had to do it, but we were very glad that person was you, Vania. Thank you. Thanks again, everybody. We'll see you all soon. Thanks for joining us. Have a wonderful rest of your day and weekend. And
Happy Valentine's Day.
Forgot about that.
Yeah, me too. Me too.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.